Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
All right, listener name, ready for it. Picture this, 1945, February. We're on the chilly Crimean Peninsula, inside a former Tsar's palace. But this is no holiday. This is Yalta, and the fate of a post-war world is on the line. You sent over a ton of material on this one, so let's dive right in. We've got Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, the big three, staring down the end of World War II. But winning, that's just the first act, isn't it? Figuring out what comes next, that's the real game at Yalta.
Absolutely. Yalta wasn't about celebrating victory so much as shaping the peace, or at least that was the hope. And each leader, well, they brought their own baggage to the table, their own fears, their own vision, under a whole lot of pressure.
Yeah, and one source really highlighted those fears, particularly from Stalin's side. The sheer scale of Soviet losses during the war. 27 million casualties. I mean, just try wrapping your head around a number like that. It's almost impossible.
It is a staggering figure, and there's no doubt it weighed heavily on Stalin's mind. Think about the impact of that loss on families, on their entire society. It's no wonder Stalin was so fixated on security, on preventing anything like that from ever happening again.
And that's where this idea of a buffer zone comes into play, right? A ring of friendly nations around the Soviet Union's borders, not just paranoia, but a reaction born out of unimaginable trauma.
Precisely. And we have to remember, Stalin wasn't just talking. By this point, the Red Army had liberated much of Eastern Europe from the Nazis. They were a very real presence, a powerful bargaining chip at the negotiating table.
So you've got Stalin, understandably fixated on security, but also holding a pretty strong hand. What about Churchill? What's his approach to this whole thing?
Churchill, ever the pragmatist, he's walking a tightrope. On the one hand, he recognizes the threat of Soviet expansionism, but on the other hand, he knows Britain needs a stable Europe to rebuild. And let's not forget, the British Empire, while victorious, it emerged from the war financially drained, its global power diminished.
So tread carefully, but keep a hand on the tiller of global influence wherever possible. Makes sense. And Roosevelt. He strikes me as the idealist of the group. How do you approach this room full of realpolitik?
That's a pretty fair assessment. Roosevelt, he's deeply invested in this vision of a new global order. He sees the United Nations as the cornerstone of this new world, a forum for dialogue and cooperation, a way to prevent future conflicts.
A noble goal, no doubt. But idealism and reality have a funny way of clashing, and nowhere is that more apparent than in the case of Germany. One minute it's the heart of the Third Reich, the next it's, what, a giant question mark.
More like a shattered vase that the Allies are trying to piece back together. And of course, each one has a different idea of what the final product should look like. On the surface, trials for war criminals. Essentially, Germany's in for a timeout on the world stage.
Right, but how do you actually manage a nation in ruins? Turns out you carve it up like a birthday cake. 4 occupation zones, 1 each for the US, the UK, France, and of course the Soviet Union.
A practical solution, maybe, in the moment. But as we know, it ended up solidifying the division of East and West Germany, a division that went on to become the very heart of the Cold War. 2 Germanys, each reflecting the superpower that controlled it, separated by the Iron Curtain.
Talk about unintended consequences. But even as they're divvying up Germany, there's another issue causing tension. Reparations.
Ah, yes, the $20 billion question. The Allies agreed that Germany should pay for the unimaginable destruction it had caused. And the Soviet Union, having borne the brunt of the Nazi war machine, they were slated to receive half of that.
I can see where this is going. It's one thing to agree on a number, another entirely to collect it from a nation in ruins. And speaking of nations caught in the crosshairs of these negotiations, let's talk about Poland. Sandwiched between Germany and the Soviet Union, it became a focal point for a lot of the tensions simmering at Yalta.
Poland found itself in an impossible position, a victim of Nazi aggression, yet also a pawn in this emerging Cold War chess game.
Because even though they were technically on the side of the Allies, Poland gets sliced and diced, their borders redrawn to satisfy Stalin's need for a buffer zone.
Not just redrawn, really, shifted westward. The Curzon Line, a proposed boundary from back in World War I that became Poland's new eastern border, meant ceding a huge chunk of their territory to the Soviets.
So they endure Nazi occupation only to lose even more land. Talk about adding insult to injury.
And as if that wasn't enough, Poland was compensated with territories to the west that had belonged to Germany, along what became known as the Oder-Neisse Line.
Which I'm guessing did little to smooth over relations between those two nations. But wait, wasn't there some talk of free and democratic elections in Poland? Surely that counted for something, right?
That's the million-dollar phrase, isn't it? Free and democratic elections. Except what those words meant to Stalin. Well, let's just say his definition might have needed a bit of work.
More like free and democratic with a big ol' asterisk next to it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, not exactly the fresh start the Polish people were hoping for after all that.
It was a tough situation all around. The Soviets, they'd publicly endorsed this idea of self-determination, but behind the scenes, they were backing the communist-led Lublin government in Poland, stacking the deck, so to speak.
And then there's the whole Katyn Forest massacre looming in the background. Thousands of Polish officers executed by the Soviets back in 1940. That's not exactly a wound that heals overnight.
No, not at all. The shadow of Katyn loomed large over the entire Yalta Conference. You've got the Soviets pledging support for a free and independent Poland while simultaneously covering up this horrific crime against the Polish people. It created this deep well of mistrust towards Soviet intentions.
Understandably so. Seems like every promise at Yalta came with a side of betrayal or hidden agenda. But hey, it wasn't just Europe's fate hanging in the balance, was it? The war in the Pacific was still raging on. Did Yalta even touch on that whole inferno?
They did, and that's where we see Stalin's shrewd negotiating skills really come into play.
Yeah.
With the war in Europe winding down, the Allies were desperate to get Soviet support against Japan. Stalin, being the opportunist that he was, used that to his advantage.
Never let a good crisis go to waste. Right. So what did he walk away with? What did Stalin manage to secure for his help in the Pacific?
Oh, he drove a hard bargain. In exchange for joining the war against Japan, Stalin secured territorial concessions in Asia. We're talking about the southern half of Sakhalin Island, a territory they'd previously lost to Japan, and the Kuril Islands, this strategically important archipelago stretching from Japan toward the Kamchatka Peninsula.
Let me guess. Not a popular move with, say, Japan, or others with a stake in the Pacific for that matter.
Let's just say it added another layer of complexity to an already incredibly complex situation. Remember, the U.S. was deeply invested in defeating Japan and ending that war. They saw Soviet assistance as crucial, even if it meant making concessions that could come back to bite them later on.
Classic short-term gain, long-term consequences. Put out one fire, potentially start another.
It highlights the impossible situation these leaders found themselves in. Immense pressure, imperfect information, and trying to forge peace in a world still very much on fire.
It really makes you wonder what they'd think if they could see the world they helped create. And speaking of creating the world, we can't forget about the other major outcome of Yalta, the agreement to establish the United Nations. What was the big hope for this new organization?
The UN was really the cornerstone of Roosevelt's vision for a more stable, peaceful post-war world. The idea was to create a forum where nations could come together, air their grievances, and hopefully prevent future wars through diplomacy and collective action.
A noble goal, no question. But I'm sensing it wasn't exactly a magic bullet for international disagreements.
Of course not. The UN, it wasn't going to magically eliminate conflict, but it did provide a framework for dialogue, a platform for nations to work together on shared challenges, even with the growing tensions of the Cold War.
So, a mixed bag then. Successes, failures. It's interesting, though. We often look at something like the UN and wonder why it hasn't delivered world peace yet. But maybe just existing, just providing that space for dialogue, is a victory in itself, considering what the alternative could be.
It certainly makes you think. The fact that the UN has endured for as long as it has, through all the crises and conflicts, speaks to this very human desire for a more peaceful, cooperative world, even if that goal remains frustratingly out of reach.
It does make you wonder if that desire for cooperation was really shared by everyone at Yalta. I mean, we talked about Stalin's desire for that buffer zone, his maneuvering in Asia, not exactly the moves of someone looking to sing Kumbaya,
And then there's the Declaration for Liberated Europe, a document seemingly overflowing with these lofty ideals, but one that would quickly get tangled in the messy realities of the emerging Cold War.
The Declaration for Liberated Europe. It sounds like something straight out of a superhero comic. A promise of freedom and democracy for all. What was the reality on the ground? It did. Like, cue the confetti and release the doves. Freedom and democracy for everyone. Except, maybe not so much.
Yeah, on paper, it was a beautiful thing. The Declaration, it talked about the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live. I mean, that's the dream, right? Self-determination, democratic processes, these war-torn nations finally getting to chart their own course.
Sign me up. Where do I enlist for this utopia? So what went wrong? Was there trouble from the get-go, or did things just kind of sour later on?
Well, let's just say Stalin's signature on that document came with, shall we say, a few caveats. He was happy to talk the talk, but his actions in the months and years that followed told a different story.
Oh, I know that one. It's the classic do as I say, not as I do routine.
So what were some of those red flags? What tipped people off that this declaration wasn't going to be the fairy tale ending everyone was hoping for? Well, the reality on the ground, especially in Eastern Europe, it wasn't quite so picture perfect. The declaration might have promised freedom and democracy, but Soviet influence, it took on let's call it a hands-on approach.
Hands-on being a euphemism for.
Let's just say they weren't afraid to back communist parties, even if it meant bending the rules a bit, or a lot, depending on who you ask. Elections got manipulated, outcomes conveniently aligned with Soviet interests. The seeds of the Eastern Bloc, they were being sown right then and there, even as the world was busy celebrating the end of the war.
So much for self-determination. It's just,
Yeah.
it's heartbreaking. You know, these nations, they're devastated, they're desperate to rebuild, to govern themselves, and they end up caught in the middle of this power struggle between superpowers.
It's a tragedy for sure, and it gets right to the heart of why Yalta is still so controversial. Was it a genuine attempt at post-war cooperation that just fell apart, or was it doomed from the start, a cynical power grab dressed up as a peace mission?
Talk about a historical head-scratcher, and I'm guessing there's no easy answer to that one.
You got it. It all depends on which historian you ask, on their perspective, on how they interpret the evidence.
History. Rarely a simple yes or no, huh? But, okay, big picture question here. Do you think the choices made at Yalta, were they unavoidable? Like, could things have played out differently, or were they always destined to end with this Cold War standoff?
Ah, the what-if game. Historians love to play it, but it's impossible to know for sure, isn't it? We can analyze, we can debate, but we can't rewind the clock and see what might have happened.
Sadly, no time machines yet. But hey, even without one, we can still learn from these choices, understand the context, grapple with the legacy they left behind. So that's got to count for something, right?
It has to. And the legacy of Yalta is one tangled web, that's for sure. It shaped the map of the world for decades, cast a long shadow over the 20th century, and we're still feeling its effects today.
So there you have it, listener name, Yalta. A wartime conference in a palace, full of hope, impossible choices, and consequences that echoed through generations. We saw how victory parades can't hide underlying tensions, how peace and power made for uneasy bedfellows, and how the decisions of a few can change the fate of millions.
It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just dates in a textbook. It's real people, big ideas, and that very human struggle to build a better future, even when the past is still smoldering.
A powerful image to end on. And that's where we'll leave you to ponder the legacy of Yalta. A conference that reminds us, even in the wake of victory, some of the toughest battles are fought not on the front lines, but at the negotiating table, where the fate of nations and the hope for lasting peace hang in the balance. This deep dive might be over for now, but the conversation, as always, continues.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.